All right, so let's get started. Thank you very much for coming to this session. I know it's the last but final session of the conference. My name is Vidya Raman. I work in product management at Cloudera. I lead product management for their machine learning platform. The commercially available product name is Cloudera Data Science Workbench. Prior to Cloudera, I worked in IoT, healthcare, telecom. So I've worked in a few different regulatory businesses, building software enterprise products primarily for the last couple of decades. So as part of my day job in Cloudera, we build technology products. So we talk all day about platforms, batch, streaming, Spark, Hive, Pig, so on and so forth. And I'm sure there have been a fair share of those technical talks through the conference. But for this talk, though, I want to up-level the conversation a bit and talk about other considerations that are important for companies to consider, especially as they embark on their data journey. Or, if you're already in your data journey, what are some of the important considerations to keep in mind? So, I'll start with something which is very obvious, which is, we are all trying to take the data that we have or collect more data and basically, make gold out of it. Or if you prefer oil, make oil. We've all heard it, right? Data is the new gold, data is the new oil. And it's really about, getting there. Now, you might wonder, why is it that, Now, you might wonder, why is it that she's talking about something as blatantly obvious as that? Or maybe you're thinking, oh, here comes a greedy capitalist. Either way, I think the reason I bring this up is because we've seen in many conversations when you're in the thick of figuring out whether you need to batch or stream or hybrid or cloud or on-prem, in the thick of all these discussions, it's easy to lose sight of what exactly most nonprofit organizations are trying to do with data. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind. And one of the analogies that comes to my mind is what Tolstoy, the Russian author, and Anna Karenina said, which is all successful data projects, I would say, look alike in terms of having a clear line of sight to the end goal, whereas almost every other non-successful data projects look dissimilar, in terms of why they didn't succeed. And there are a couple of other factors. Okay, this clicker is behaving a little weird. There are a couple of other factors that come into play in terms of how organizations are going at it differently. So there is the time dimension in terms of how quickly organizations aspire to get to that pot of gold, and then there are variations in terms of how much investment organizations are willing to put in. And the investments really are importantly categorized in terms of what goes into the people, process, and infrastructure aspect of things. So people, because we need those skill sets, the new language, if you will, in the era of data, and the processors are required in order to ensure that people are being productive, and the infrastructure to help the people and the processes. But it's really in that descending order of priority, with people being front and center. I know that too is kind of an irony to say this in a data conference, where data is supposed to be all objective and cold, and here I am saying that people are the most important. So the way, for the rest of the session, I'm going to give you some real-life examples that I have seen in my life, as well as from our customers at Cloudera across multiple industry verticals, and what we can learn from them. Clicker. Okay, should I be pointing it in a different direction? Okay, maybe I'll use this. All right. So the first story that I want to share with you is from this maker of heavy industrial equipment. So I can tell in talking to folks in the room, there are some folks who are in the IoT space, so maybe you can relate to this. So this is what some might call an old economy company. They've been very successful building farm equipment, industrial heavy equipment for decades. They have billions in revenue. They start putting sensors initially for monitoring and then eventually for control. And with that, they formally enter the world of IoT. They've been collecting a lot of data for a few years. The board and management get excited and they say, okay, they read all these market research reports from the likes of Gartner and Forrester and such, and see that there are billions of dollars to be made from the IoT space, and they ask the management to jump into it. So management, what they do is they faithfully go and recruit, a whole team of data scientists and researchers, basically the best minds in the industry across multiple countries they can find, and create this corporate research group. And this corporate research group, they are phenomenal people. So in about a year since the inception of this group, there are a whole bunch of proof of concepts that are going on everywhere across the world, right? They win a bunch of awards. There are customers who are deploying this in these pilots or proof of concepts, as they call it. The folks are winning awards in conferences. They're even presenting at conferences which are reputed for machine learning and data science, such as SNPs. So things cannot be going better for this group, right, in terms of what the management wants. Unfortunately, year 2 since the inception of this corporate research group, this group is not making sufficient revenue. At least it's really a small blip in the radar compared to what the management asked them to do when they read those initial market research reports. So what exactly is happening here? So by year 3, management loses patience, and the corporate research team is actually pretty surprised. They are not sure why exactly management is disappointed. And worse yet, they blame the business units. So what that picture actually showed, which I forgot to cover here, is basically this corporate research group is set up in a hub and spoke model. So the corporate research group being in the hub, that's where all the data scientists reside, or at least the experts reside. And the folks in the hubs are the ones who, the spokes basically, are the business units who are the device makers who are generating the data. So this was the setup, and so the corporate research team blames the business units. There are several things that went wrong here, but I will start from the very top, which is basically a missed expectation in terms of what the senior management set for the broader business units, right? So they basically threw in a bunch of people at the data and expected, big pot of gold at the end. And while this is not the only problem that happened, there is a reason why this is particularly pronounced in some industries, especially IoT. It's particularly notorious. So I have nothing against market research companies, by the way. I do read Forrester and Gartner, and I love for my products to be highly regarded by these market research companies. They're very important for us as a company, Cloudera, as well. But the reason I bring this up is because not all markets can be easily sized, and not even if you can size it, from a total addressable market standpoint, it doesn't always lend itself to something that business units can relate to and then produce tangible revenues on. So some examples of markets where top-down market research works pretty well are areas where markets are very well defined, or there are existing markets, either one. So for instance, if you are in the business of using genomic data to find a cure for a specific kind of cancer, or if your company is trying to enter the autonomous driving space, tops-down works quite a bit. But in some spaces where, like IoT is an example, but there are several more like that, bottoms-up market research and using that data to drive organization goals is far more effective. Some other things that actually went wrong, to wrap up this example and move on, are, again, we had this issue of the central research and the hubs. Again, this is not specifically anything critical about a centralized organization, a central research body specifically, but in order for a model like that to work, it is really essential to ensure that there are proper processes and infrastructure put in place in order for different groups to interact with each other. So what happened in this particular example was that the business units and the central research groups' incentives were not aligned. The business unit, they had their own P&L based on the devices they were producing. The central research organization had a P&L based on the data products that they had to build. So there was no alignment whatsoever. There was no infrastructure in place. So data was getting exchanged between the business units that were producing the data to the central unit via emails. So there was absolutely no attention paid to how do these groups work together and things like that. But enough said about this. But so I'll just wrap this story up by saying that it's very inspirational. It is very aspirational when management and the board comes in and says, well, let's go after this big market. But these boring details, right, the processes and the infrastructure, they actually matter a lot. So that was one example of a company that I got to see up close. So I'm going to dive into each one of these, which I just touched upon in the previous example. So the people, which, in my opinion, it's really the single most important thing for making data projects work. And people are not, they're not just the people who are producing the data products, they're also the people who are consuming. If you're actually building a data product, then you have to worry about the buyers, the users, the influencers, the enablers, the blockers. I'll get into some examples of those, as well as the processes that are in place for people who are actually producing the data, the people who are consuming the data, the people who are managing everything. And then infrastructure to ensure that the people and processes are supported. And I put infrastructure in the end, again, because as technologists, it's natural for us to think that infrastructure is the most important. But hopefully through this session, I'll try to convince you that even if it's not an afterthought, it should at least be in support of the people and processes that we want to put in place. Okay, so on to the next example here. So this company, by the name of Acme Power, they wanted to get into this big market. It's an existing market on energy theft. So I'm sure we all, are faithful people. We pay our electricity bills when they're due, but there are a lot of unscrupulous people out there who don't pay their bills. They basically steal energy, and there are very different ways of doing it. If you're curious about how to, I can tell you after the session. So there is a lot of revenue that is left. If you're in the utility energy business, there is a lot of money left on the table because people are stealing energy. So utilities, try to prevent this, or if there is a theft going on, they try to recover that revenue. So there are departments within utilities called revenue assurance departments that have. In very big utilities, there can be hundreds of people whose job it is to actually identify theft and then recover revenue. So our company here, Acme Power, they built a cool new product based on AI and machine learning, and when they piloted the product, they found out that there was a high degree of accuracy. They could identify fraud. So they started talking to these revenue assurance people who were their customers, their potential users, and so they had a huge funnel. There was a lot of interest in the product when they went out to conferences. Despite that, and they got a lot of venture funding, right? Because big market, great product, smart people, attracted a lot of funding. But something didn't go right, though. Their revenue was pretty disappointing. So there were some customers who actually bought the product, right? And there were some customers who just outright rejected it. So the ones that rejected it primarily did so for not so surprising reasons. So these revenue assurance specialists, whose job it is to go and identify theft, they feared that AI would take their jobs. So they rejected the product outright. And of the ones that did buy their product, they did start a subscription. They did not renew the subscription. And when they tried to find out why it is, then they basically started hearing about not having sufficient law enforcement support. So they were like, okay, what's going on here? So this is a mapping out of the different things that happen in the value chain in this particular use case. So starting at the very left, so in the very top is basically the cool new product this company made. It's being used by the revenue assurance specialist who basically whose job is to review any fraud that is flagged by the product. And then there is also a supervisor involved, looking over their shoulder, because the next step in that process, if there does seem to be a fraud, is to send out someone called a field technician. And this field technician, they actually go out into the field, as the name suggests, and they look for evidences of fraud. And there are some that I show here in the picture. So this is a tampered meter, which is locked into a meter cabinet in a building, hard to find sometimes. And this is an example of a marijuana farm. So marijuana farm in a residential area inside a house. So they were trying to hide that, and hence they were trying to steal energy. So this is the kind of evidence that the technician is looking for, which will basically help them confirm whether or not there was fraud happening. So once they figure out whether or not fraud is happening, the law enforcement, the police gets involved. So for the police to go any further and prosecute, they need to collect the evidence. So the evidence has to be readily available for them to then decide whether or not they go prosecute. And if they do prosecute, and there's a whole bunch of other things which I didn't have space in the slide to draw, but assuming they go all the way down, then the CFO gets their money back, right? That's the pot of gold at the end. Now, what's interesting is that if you, oh, the clicker doesn't work, okay. So the important thing to note here is that the product that our Acme Power company only addresses the problem up until this point. And it's not just the product. When you look at the marketing and sales, they were selling it to the revenue assurance specialist here and potentially their supervisor. Whereas the person who really cared about the bottom line and revenue recovery is at the far end here. And they were also targeting a lot of utilities who did not necessarily have the support of a law enforcement department. And that happens for a variety of reasons. But the bottom line here is the following, right? So it's not sufficient to just develop a cool product, because there's a big difference between actually delivering value, which in this case happened if you measure it in one way, to whether or not you've been able to capture the value. So in this case, the company, by going after people who did not necessarily have the appetite or have the right incentives to leverage the product, was not able to capture the value. So it does come down to people in this case, understanding who the different players are, who are the enablers, who are the influencers, who are the people who don't have the best interest that you're trying to relate with, and then having a systematized process in place. So if you're one of those companies, or if you're, as a traditional product management perspective, there are processes in place which, such as the customer development process, which can help whittle out these kinds of things before a product is even put out to the market. And I provide a reference to Steve Blank's Customer Development Manifesto. You can Google it. Might sound like this is just for startups, but trust me, it's not. Some of the techniques that are mentioned there are very valid for any project or product development that companies undertake. But it's, unfortunately, sometimes data projects are considered too special, and, these processes are not followed. So, okay, so let's move on to the next story. I know some of you are in banks, so hopefully this doesn't get too personal. Okay, so this happened not too long ago when me and a few colleagues were at a big bank. We call it the Big Bug Bank. And we were there, trying to understand what challenges they have. As with any successful bank out there, these guys have a lot of data. They have a lot of use for the data. They're doing lots of things with the data in terms of existing projects and stuff. They have, phenomenal amount of resources to procure as many tools and infrastructure as they need. And they also had, great infrastructure already in place. So it was intriguing to us when we heard from the executives at the company that, basically they were not happy with the pace of innovation. They were not happy with how fast they were doing, cutting edge things like, in terms of new practices that would help them be a few steps ahead of compliance or risk and things like that. So they were unhappy with the pace of innovation, and we were there trying to figure out, what's going on. So we went out to dinner with a whole bunch of people. This is user studies, so this is the fun part. You get to talk to a whole different variety of people. And it was interesting to hear that, the CEO say his biggest problem is actually employee retention. He says that, if only I could fix that, I'm able to get the best talent that money can buy. I'm able to get the best tool that money can buy, but somehow I'm not able to retain my people. And then when we talk to the other people in the organization, you can read this for yourself, So again, some of these things we've heard multiple times. Data scientists saying that I'm not doing a data scientist job. I'm doing a data janitorial job. I'm doing something that's extremely repetitive. I'm doing something that my colleague in the other department is doing. We kept hearing things like this over and over again. So if we try to peel this onion down a bit and we try to take a more holistic approach to all the different actors that we got to meet at the bank, and then we try to actually identify. So I'll start from the middle, right? So again, as technologists, this comes naturally to most of us. What do you want to enable for your data engineers, for your DevOps people? What languages they use, what frameworks, what kind of data ingest processes you need. This is just a subset of all the things that they said they wanted, or skills they had. So we started here. And then we also talked about the first column. So what are they annoyed about? So as an example, the data scientists, they wanted to pick your example of the latest framework, TensorFlow, Keras, PyTorch, what have you. We are frustrated we're not able to use that in our platform. So the first and second rows, are the ones we tend to focus on. But I would urge you to also look into the third row here. Too quick. I would urge you to look at the third row here, especially when we started hearing things like this, right? So again, quick reminder, we were talking to them over dinner and people had had some beers already. And that's when these kind of things started emerging, right? So the data analysts were actually insecure about their future in the bank. They knew that there are these cool kids on the block, the data scientists are getting hired, what's going to happen to me? Do I have to learn Python and R? Oh, that's too much for me. Or, can I get a citizen data scientist tool? That sort of thing. Or look at, what we heard from the data steward. This guy just wants to sleep at night, at peace. He doesn't want to haggle, 50 different tools trying to figure out, what's happened to my data lineage and governance and yada, yada, yada. So my point here is the following. So again, as technologists, let's focus more on the aspirational needs that people have. So not think of infrastructure or processes as an afterthought, but actually, So making sure that we have infrastructure and processes, optimal processes and infrastructure will actually end up with people who are productive and happy. So at the end of the day, again, that's why I bring it back to people. People who are unhappy, unproductive, they're not going to help management or executives get to the top right, that pot of gold out there. All right. So this is my last example, and I saved the best for last. Okay, so this is from the radiology market. And I don't know how many of you guys are already familiar with radiologists. If you do, apologize. This is a very quick primer. So radiologists, at least in a country like the United States, they make literally $500,000. It's considered one of the most secure jobs. And granted, they go to med school and do a whole bunch of other fellowships and residencies. And in the US in particular, they pay huge loans, 10 plus years of grad school alone. They're highly compensated. A big portion of what they do, though, is basically looking at medical images and then identifying diseased versus healthy states and calling them out. And if they turn out to be, if there is a suspicion of disease, then they do additional tests and recommend them to specialists and so on. And there has been a very healthy market for trying to build and sell software into these professionals, right? So for those folks who are familiar with AI ML, you probably know that there has been an exponential increase in the pace of innovation when it comes to image recognition. So it's only natural to expect that this job in particular would have been commoditized and that there would be software to automate, this space out. But the challenge has been, of course, there is a lack of trust. So you have to sell this to the radiologists in order for them to actually use it. But they are rejecting it outright because they don't want themselves to be replaced by software. But there are also other issues such as, this has been tried several times. And because companies try to take baby steps, and the reason why they take baby steps is because they realize that they are causing insecurity among the radiologists. So instead of trying to tell them exactly what to do, they try to take baby steps. But in doing so, they add more burden to the radiologist's job, right? They make them do more clicks. They make them look at more screens. This has been going on for decades now. So they don't like this kind of software at all. Pretty much every company that has tried to do this has not done very well financially. Okay, so there must be a good side to the story. Enter Radia Inc., fictitious name. This is a startup who also came up with an AI product. And these guys, they went to excellent medical school and they are excellent computer scientists. They came up with a product whose accuracy matched the experts, the radiologist experts, not just your average radiologist. So the other thing that they did was they did not sell the software directly to radiologists. Instead, what they did was they started buying up failing radiology clinics, so failing as in financially distressed radiology clinics. And clinics can be financially distressed because they don't have enough patient population. It's a very dispersed market, the radiology clinics themselves. So they bought a bunch of radiology clinics, and they started turning them around by streamlining operations. And if you know the meaning of streamlining, you know that software is involved there, right? So basically what they did is they did not eliminate the radiologist's job, but they introduced a bunch of software, and their focus was to provide the best possible service to patients. So in an area where there are multiple competing radiology clinics and there were a few that are distressed, they would buy up these distressed clinics and really provide exemplary service to the patients, and hence improving the patient volume. So that's kind of their business model here. They are not selling software to radiologists, right? Although they have this product, that's what got them originally started. And guess how they're doing? So financially speaking, within a year from inception, this is actually a cash flow positive company. They have multi-million-dollar in revenue, right? And these are basically people who originally thought of doing what has been tried and tested before. So if I want to leave you with one thought, and this is the last slide here, it's this, that there is a lot of talk about best practices, ideas being borrowed from here and there, and what we can learn from others' failures. But I would urge for you all to also not forget to think outside the box. So I hope this was helpful. That's the end of my session. If there are any questions, let me know. Thanks. All right.
Have the company from the first example succeed after all or not?
That company is, let me say that they are pivoting their business model at this time. They are trying to make their approach more decentralized. So they have moved away from a centralized, from having centralized data scientists and data groups. They've started transplanting those data scientists, embedding them into the business units. They've realized that in the beginning, they over-optimized their business, so to speak. So instead of trying to have every center as a P&L, they now have an R&D center, which is just a cost center. And then they have these individual business units tasked with P&L for the data products. So they have made some adjustments.
And what kind of consultancy Cloudera had done for them?
This is not a company that Cloudera has consulted for. This is from my prior life experience. So Cloudera does offer consulting, as it relates especially to machine learning and data science. So Cloudera basically purchased a company called Fast Forward Labs I think it was about a year and a half ago. And the group basically does research, but they also provide consulting for data science and machine learning, everything from strategy to they develop prototyping. Applied research is their primary focus.
It seems more like a psychological consultancy or even human resources consultancy to build the right processes, not only machine learning.
It totally is. And I think so. My background originally is in product management. I mean, even now I'm in product management. So what's interesting for me to see is that a lot of companies which are embarking on data projects or building data products even, they seem to think that an entirely new approach has to be taken. But, if you come to think of all the different ways that products have failed in the past, you'll realize that, some of those same learnings apply to even building a data product. So yeah.
And for what branch are you responsible in Cloudera for product management?
Oh, I lead the machine learning products. So that is Cloudera Data Science Workbench and the cloud native product that we are yet to announce.
And could you say like a couple of words about product management for machine learning? Because it seems like it's too technical. So what's your main responsibilities? Are you trying to tie business KPIs or business metrics, or actually business goals with this underlying fancy geeks, metrics, and KPIs? What's your usual responsibilities?
So in Cloudera, so Cloudera builds platform products, right? So which are cutting across multiple industry verticals. So we don't necessarily engage with our customers' data unless it is in the context of Fast Forward Labs consulting engagement I just mentioned. So in the context of what I do in Cloudera, it is really to enable data scientists to do their job by working with all of the other personas that, one of the slides I had showed people like data engineers, data stewards, DevOps, all of these people work together to in a sort of a pseudo but holistic team. So it is really trying to enable them to do their job in the most productive way possible. So there it really comes down to understanding what workflows to support, what skills people have, what are their aspiration needs, what processes should be in place to make machine learning, in the words of Hilary Mason, our general manager, exactly, how to make machine learning as boring as possible, right? So it's really systematizing the whole aspect of building machine learning at scale. But in general, though, so in my previous life, I've done product management for data products, so where data is one of the essential inputs for product. And there, you're right. I mean, it's I'd say in terms of metrics to use, it still comes down to who your target audience is, because if you're familiar with data science, you probably know that it's not all about accuracy all the time. Right? You can have the most accurate product, but if people don't understand, they don't trust it or they can't use it. So I think there is definitely an aspect of product managing a data science product, which involves understanding data science as much as it is to understand the people who are going to be using it and the problem it is intended to solve. So I think that's a little bit more complicated than just doing a platform product.
Right.
That's just my opinion.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for the question. All right. Okay. If there are no more questions, we'll close. Thank you very much again. Enjoy the rest of your conference.